My husband's college buddy bet him I'd break down sobbing when they served me divorce papers at our Valentine's dinner. She's too soft, Wyatt, too dependent. Spencer Grant laughed from the kitchen doorway. They didn't know I was standing in the hallway, frozen with a bottle of wine in my hands, listening to them gamble on my heartbreak. Wyatt's voice drifted back, smooth and confident. She'll crumble completely. Watch me break her tonight.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tell us a duh.
That was 3 hours before I signed those papers without blinking, then handed him a red velvet box that made both their faces go white. But this story doesn't begin there. Not really. The unraveling started long before they wagered on my tears, long before Valentine's Day became a battlefield instead of a celebration. It started with something much quieter, much more insidious. It started with words disguised as love. You have to understand who Wyatt Hugh was to grasp how perfectly he orchestrated his own destruction. Corporate lawyer, Georgetown law graduate, the kind of man who wore confidence like expensive cologne. He had that particular brand of charm that made waitresses linger at our table and made my friends tell me how lucky I was. "Brianna, he's such a catch," they'd say, watching him pull out my chair or order wine with practiced authority. What they didn't see were the small corrections, how he'd lean over during dinner parties and whisper, "You're talking too much, sweetheart," with that indulgent smile that made it sound like helpful advice instead of control. Or how he'd laugh when I mentioned wanting to go back to school, saying, "What would you study, honey? You already have your MRS degree," while everyone chuckled at his wit. I was 24 when we married, fresh out of college with a psychology degree I'd barely started to use, swept off my feet by a man 8 years older who seemed to have everything figured out. Wyatt made me feel chosen, special, like I'd won some cosmic lottery by catching his attention. He loved that I was young, impressionable, grateful for his guidance in navigating the adult world he already conquered. "You don't need to work, Brianna," he'd said during our engagement, his hands cupping my face like I was something precious and fragile. "I make enough for both of us. Focus on making our home beautiful, on being the wife I need you to be." It sounded romantic then, like protection, like love. The first year was a careful dance of small surrenders. I stopped mentioning job applications after he'd frown and change the subject. I let him handle all our finances because numbers aren't really your strength, are they, darling? I moved us to his preferred neighborhood, decorated in his preferred style, learned to cook the meals he grew up eating. Each compromise felt reasonable in isolation, tiny adjustments to blend our lives together. But Wyatt was an architect of erosion. He didn't tear me down with dramatic scenes or explosive anger. He was far too sophisticated for that. Instead, he carved away pieces of me so gradually, so gently, that I barely noticed what was disappearing until I looked in the mirror one day and didn't recognize the woman staring back. He had rules that weren't called rules, preferences that became non-negotiable. I learned not to wear red lipstick after he mentioned it made me look desperate for attention. I stopped buying books after he commented on how cluttered they made the house feel. I gradually lost touch with college friends who didn't fit his vision of appropriate company, women he deemed too loud, too opinionated, too single. "You're becoming so refined," he'd tell me, running his fingers through my hair, "so much more elegant than those girls you used to run around with." I'd lean into his touch, proud to have earned his approval, not understanding that approval given conditionally isn't love, it's training. The isolation happened so slowly I didn't feel it closing around me like water over my head. Phone calls from my sister Diane became less frequent, then stopped altogether after Wyatt made a few pointed comments about her drama. My weekly coffee dates with my college roommate Elaine ended after he started scheduling couples activities during those same time slots. My world contracted until it revolved entirely around Wyatt's orbit, his schedule, his moods, his needs. By year 3, I could read his face like weather patterns. The slight tightening around his eyes meant I'd said something that embarrassed him. The particular way he set down his fork meant my cooking wasn't meeting his standards. The long pause before he answered when someone asked about my day meant I'd shared too much, been too present in a conversation that was supposed to center around him. I became a master of preemptive apologies. Sorry I forgot to pick up your dry cleaning. Sorry, dinner's running late. Sorry I laughed too loud at Spencer's story. Sorry for taking up space, for having opinions, for existing in ways that required his patience. The truly insidious part was how skillfully he made me complicit in my own diminishment. When I'd get frustrated and try to push back, he'd look genuinely hurt and say things like, "I'm just trying to help you be the best version of yourself, Brianna. Don't you want that too?" He'd frame his criticism as concern, his control as protection, his manipulation as devotion. "I worry about you" became his favorite phrase. "I worry about you when you drive alone at night. I worry about you making financial decisions without me. I worry about you trusting people too easily." Each worry became a new boundary, a new limitation presented as care. And the worst part? I believed him. I internalized his voice until it became my own inner critic. When I'd feel a flash of resentment or a moment of rebellion, I'd hear his reasonable tone explaining why my feelings were wrong, why his way was better, why I should be grateful instead of ungrateful. The version of myself that had once dreamed of graduate school, of travel, of building something meaningful with my life, grew fainter each year until she felt like someone I'd known in another lifetime. Someone young and naive who hadn't understood how the world really worked, who hadn't yet learned the valuable lesson that love meant sacrifice, and that the person with more experience, more money, more power naturally knew what was best. That woman who'd once planned to specialize in trauma psychology, who'd wanted to help people heal from the damage others had done to them, became a ghost haunting the edges of my own life. But ghosts have a way of returning when you least expect them. And on Valentine's Day, surrounded by red roses and candlelight and the sound of two men betting on my breakdown, she finally found her voice again. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but sitting in that hallway, wine bottle trembling in my grip, listening to my husband discuss my inevitable collapse like a sporting event, something ancient and powerful stirred to life inside me. Something that had been sleeping but never truly dead. They thought they knew me. They thought 5 years of conditioning had erased who I used to be. They were about to discover how wrong they were. The restaurant was Wyatt's choice, naturally. La Bernardin, where he'd proposed 3 years earlier, where the waitstaff knew his order and treated him like visiting royalty. He'd made the reservation without asking what I wanted, the way he made most decisions in our marriage. Small choices that seemed considerate on the surface, but carried the quiet weight of assumption that my preferences weren't worth consulting. "You look beautiful tonight," he said as the sommelier poured our wine. But his eyes were already scanning the room, cataloging who was there, who might notice us, who mattered. I'd learned to recognize the difference between compliments meant for me and compliments meant for his image. This was the latter. I wore the black dress he'd bought me for Christmas, the one that came with the unspoken understanding that my own fashion choices weren't quite sophisticated enough for his professional circles. The neckline was higher than I preferred, the hemline longer, the whole silhouette designed to whisper respectable wife rather than desirable woman. But I'd learned to find safety in disappearing into his vision of who I should be. "Thank you," I said, smoothing the fabric over my lap. "You look handsome too." And he did. Wyatt had the kind of polished appearance that photographs well, that commands attention in boardrooms and cocktail parties. Salt and pepper hair at 32 that made him look distinguished rather than premature. Expensive suits that fit like they were painted on. The watch his father gave him when he made partner, heavy with inherited authority. But I'd started noticing things about his handsomeness that used to escape me. How his smile never quite reached his eyes when he was performing for others. How his jawline tightened almost imperceptibly when someone disagreed with him. How his hands, which once made me feel cherished, had developed a habit of proprietary touching, steering me by the elbow, placing his palm on the small of my back in a way that felt more like ownership than affection.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Spencer's joining us for dessert, he mentioned casually, cutting into his salmon with surgical precision. He wanted to celebrate the Morrison case settlement. I nodded, fork halfway to my mouth, though something cold settled in my stomach. Spencer Grant had been Wyatt's roommate at Georgetown, his best man at our wedding, his closest friend and biggest enabler. Where Wyatt's cruelty was surgical, Spencer's was blunt force trauma. He had a way of making jokes at my expense that always went just far enough to sting, but never far enough to call out without seeming oversensitive. "That's nice," I said, though we both knew I didn't mean it. Spencer had a talent for arriving just when Wyatt and I were having our rare moments of genuine connection, armed with inside jokes from their bachelor days and barely veiled comments about how marriage had domesticated his friend. "He mentioned bringing someone," Wyatt continued, and something in his tone made me look up from my plate. There was a particular quality to his voice when he was testing me, when he was laying groundwork for some future maneuver I wouldn't see coming until it was too late. "Someone?" "Abigail Sanders. She's new at Morrison Klein & Associates. Corporate law, like us. Very impressive resume." The way he said impressive made my chest tighten. It was the same tone he used when talking about restaurants I couldn't pronounce the names of, wines I couldn't identify by taste, books he'd read that I hadn't. It was the tone that reminded me, gently but persistently, of all the ways I failed to measure up to his standards. "That's nice that Spencer's dating someone," I managed, though I could feel the trap closing around me before I even understood what it was. "They're not dating," Wyatt said, his smile sharp around the edges. "She's just brilliant company, the kind of woman who can hold her own in any conversation." He paused, letting that sink in. "You'll like her. She reminds me of you, actually. Or rather, who you used to be." There it was. The knife slid between my ribs so smoothly I barely felt it until the bleeding started. Who you used to be? As if the woman sitting across from him was some pale imitation of a more vibrant original. As if 5 years of marriage to him had somehow diminished me rather than completed me. I took a sip of wine to buy time, to swallow the words that wanted to spill out. "What do you mean, who I used to be? When was I different? What did I lose? And when did you stop loving the person I became?" But I'd learned that questions like those never led anywhere good. They led to long conversations about my insecurities, my tendency to overthink, my need to be more confident in myself. "I'm sure she's lovely," I said instead, and watched satisfaction flicker across his features. He liked it when I played along, when I accepted his subtle corrections without resistance. It made him feel generous, magnanimous, like he was being patient with a slow student rather than cruel to his wife. Spencer arrived as we were finishing our entrees, bringing with him the particular energy of a man who believed his own entertainment value was a gift to everyone around him. He kissed my cheek with practiced charm and slapped Wyatt on the back like they were still fraternity brothers instead of 30-something professionals. "Brianna, you look radiant as always," he said, though his eyes had already moved past me to scan the restaurant. "Though I have to say, married life is making you both look a little too comfortable. Where's the passion, the fire?" He said it like a joke, but Spencer's jokes always had teeth. They were designed to draw blood while maintaining plausible deniability, to make you feel foolish for being hurt by something that was obviously meant in good fun. "We're very happy," I said, reaching for Wyatt's hand across the table. But instead of taking it, he was already standing to greet someone behind me. "Abigail," he said, and the warmth in his voice was different from the tone he'd used with me all evening. "I'm so glad Spencer convinced you to join us." I turned to see a woman about my age, maybe younger, with the kind of effortless elegance that comes from good breeding and excellent education. Auburn hair that caught the light, intelligent green eyes that seemed to take in everything at once, a handshake that was firm without trying to prove anything. She was beautiful in the way I'd once been beautiful, before I learned to dim myself to make Wyatt shine brighter. Brianna, meet Abigail Sanders, Spencer said, his grin widening. Harvard Law, just made junior partner at 28. She's everything our boy Wyatt here claims to value in a woman. The comment hit its mark perfectly. Not cruel enough to object to, just pointed enough to draw blood. It was a masterpiece of social surgery, designed to make me feel inadequate while making everyone else feel slightly uncomfortable on my behalf. "It's wonderful to meet you," Abigail said, and her smile seemed genuine, though I caught her glancing between Wyatt and Spencer with something that might have been confusion or concern.
As she slid into the booth beside Spencer, I watched Wyatt's face transform. The polite attention he'd been giving me all evening sharpened into something more focused, more alive. He leaned forward, asked her about cases she was working on, listened to her answers with the kind of engagement he used to show me back when my thoughts seemed worth hearing. Brianna used to be in psychology, Spencer mentioned during a lull in their legal shop talk, and I could feel the slight emphasis on used to be, the gentle reminder that I'd abandoned any professional ambitions to focus on being Wyatt's wife. Really? Abigail turned to me with what seemed like genuine interest. What area? I was interested in trauma therapy, I said, and immediately regretted it when I saw Wyatt's almost imperceptible wince. He'd always found my interest in psychology slightly embarrassing, too touchy-feely for his taste, too focused on feelings rather than facts. "That's incredible work," Abigail said. "So important, especially now. Are you still practicing?" The silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable. I could feel Wyatt willing me to say something appropriate, something that wouldn't reflect poorly on him or suggest that our marriage had somehow prevented me from pursuing meaningful work. "I've been focusing on other things," I said finally, and watched Wyatt's shoulders relax slightly. "Lucky woman," Spencer chimed in. "Not everyone can afford to be a lady of leisure." And there it was again, that particular brand of casual cruelty disguised as observation. Lady of leisure, as if my days were spent getting manicures and having lunch with friends, rather than managing every detail of Wyatt's domestic life, from his dry cleaning to his social calendar to his emotional needs. But as I sat there, watching my husband light up in conversation with a woman who represented everything I'd once been and apparently no longer was, something began to shift inside me. Something quiet but insistent, like a voice I'd thought was silenced forever, clearing its throat in the darkness. The weeks following that Valentine's dinner marked a turning point, though I didn't recognize it at first. Wyatt had found a new favorite topic of conversation, Abigail Sanders and her impressive career trajectory. It started innocently enough, mentions of cases she was working on, legal strategies she'd suggested, insights she'd shared during their increasingly frequent professional consultations. "You should have heard Abigail's take on the Henderson merger," he'd say over breakfast, scrolling through his phone while I poured his coffee. "Brilliant analysis. She sees angles that would never occur to most people." The implication hung in the air like smoke, unlike some people he knew. I tried to show interest, to ask follow-up questions, to be the supportive wife who celebrated her husband's professional relationships. But each conversation felt like a tiny paper cut, insignificant alone, but accumulating into something that drew blood. The comparisons became more frequent, more pointed. When I struggled to follow a conversation at one of his firm's cocktail parties, he'd lean over afterward and say, "Abigail would have kept up with that discussion. She has this way of making everything sound effortless." When I suggested we try a new restaurant, he'd counter with, "Abigail mentioned this place that sounds much more interesting. She has exquisite taste." It wasn't jealousy I felt, not exactly. It was something deeper and more corrosive. The slow realization that I was being systematically replaced in my husband's mind by a superior model. Every mention of Abigail's accomplishments was an implicit criticism of my limitations. Every praise of her intelligence was a subtle indictment of my inadequacy. My sister Diane called one Thursday evening while Wyatt was working late, again. "You sound tired," she said after we'd exchanged pleasantries. "Everything okay?" I almost told her, the words crowded against my teeth, desperate for release. "I'm disappearing. My husband is falling in love with someone else right in front of me. I feel like I'm slowly suffocating in my own life."
But I'd learned to edit myself, to present only the acceptable version of my reality. Just busy, I said instead. Wyatt's been working on some big cases. With that woman you mentioned, Angela? Abigail. The correction came out sharper than I intended, and yes, they're collaborating on several projects. There was a pause, the kind pregnant with things my sister wanted to say but knew better than to voice. Diane had never warmed to Wyatt, though she'd learned to keep her opinions to herself after a few early confrontations that left me defending him and her feeling shut out. "Brianna," she said carefully, "you know you can talk to me about anything, right? If something's wrong—" "Nothing's wrong," I interrupted, and the speed of my denial convinced neither of us. Wyatt's just passionate about his work. It's one of the things I love about him. Another pause. Then, "When's the last time you and I spent time together? Just us?" The question caught me off guard. I couldn't remember. Our monthly sister lunches had gradually been replaced by couples activities that Wyatt preferred. Our phone calls had become shorter, less frequent, carefully scheduled around his needs and moods. Even this conversation felt stolen, conducted in hushed tones while he was safely out of earshot. "We should plan something," I said, but we both knew I wouldn't follow through. Wouldn't risk Wyatt's subtle disapproval, his questions about why I needed time away from our marriage, his gentle suggestions that I seemed to be pulling away from him lately. "I miss you," Diane said simply, and the 3 words hit me like a physical blow. When had I become someone who needed to be missed by my own sister? After I hung up, I stood in our pristine kitchen, surrounded by wedding china we never used and appliances chosen for their aesthetic appeal rather than their functionality, and felt like a ghost haunting someone else's life. The woman who used to stay up all night talking with Diane about everything and nothing, who used to have opinions and dreams and a voice that mattered, felt as distant as a character from a book I'd read long ago. The social isolation had happened so gradually I'd barely noticed. College friends who used to text regularly had stopped reaching out after months of canceled plans and rain checks. My book club membership had lapsed when I kept missing meetings. Even casual acquaintances had learned not to invite me to things, tired of hearing variations of, "I'll have to check with Wyatt," followed by polite declines. But it wasn't just social isolation, it was intellectual starvation. I'd stopped reading books that weren't on Wyatt's approved list, stopped watching movies he found frivolous, stopped listening to music he deemed unsophisticated. My world had contracted until it was shaped entirely by his preferences, his schedule, his definition of what constituted worthwhile pursuits. The financial isolation was more subtle but equally complete. Wyatt handled all our money with the benevolent authority of someone managing a child's allowance. I had credit cards, but he reviewed the statements. I had access to our joint account, but he questioned any expenditure over $50. He framed it as financial responsibility, protection against my admitted weakness with numbers, loving guidance to help me make better choices. "You don't need to worry about money, sweetheart," he'd say when I'd occasionally ask about our savings or investment strategy. "That's what I'm here for. Focus on the things you're good at." But what was I good at? The question haunted me more frequently as the weeks passed. I'd gotten better at anticipating his moods, at managing his domestic needs, at being the kind of wife who reflected well on him at professional gatherings. But those felt like skills born of necessity rather than talent, adaptations to survive rather than abilities to celebrate. The morning everything shifted permanently, I was organizing Wyatt's home office while he was at a deposition. He'd asked me to file some papers, sort through correspondence, basic administrative tasks that made me feel useful while keeping me safely away from anything important enough to matter. I was reaching for a folder that had fallen behind his desk when I found the phone. Not his usual phone, a second device, smaller, hidden beneath a stack of law journals. My hands trembled as I picked it up, though I told myself I was just being curious, not suspicious. Wives didn't spy on husbands. Wives trusted their partners. But the screen was unlocked, and the most recent text thread was right there, impossible to ignore. A. Dinner was perfect last night. You were right about the wine. W. I know what you like. Same time tomorrow? A. Can't wait. She doesn't suspect anything, does she? W. Brianna? God, no. She's completely oblivious. Too busy playing housewife to notice what's right in front of her. A. Good. I'd hate for things to get complicated. W. They won't. She's not exactly the confrontational type. The phone slipped from my fingers, clattering to the floor with a sound like breaking glass. I stared at it lying there beside my knees, proof of my husband's betrayal glowing on the screen, and waited for the tears to come. Waited for the rage, the heartbreak, the dramatic collapse they clearly expected. Instead, I felt something cold and sharp settling in my chest, something that felt suspiciously like relief. Because now I knew. The vague sense of unease, the growing feeling that I was competing in a contest I didn't know I'd entered, the gradual erosion of my place in my own marriage, all of it finally made sense. I wasn't going crazy. I wasn't being paranoid or insecure or overly sensitive. I was being replaced. Carefully, I set the phone back where I'd found it, made sure the papers were filed exactly as Wyatt had requested, and went downstairs to make his favorite dinner. But as I chopped vegetables and seasoned meat, something fundamental had changed. I was no longer the naive wife stumbling blindly toward heartbreak. I was a woman who finally understood the game being played around her. And more importantly, I was a woman who was tired of losing. The Morrison, Klein & Associates annual gala was held at the Metropolitan Club, one of those old money establishments where power brokers gathered to celebrate their own importance. Wyatt had been looking forward to it for weeks, not because he enjoyed these events, but because they were opportunities to be seen, to network, to remind everyone of his value to the firm. I'd spent hours getting ready, choosing the navy cocktail dress he'd bought me specifically for occasions like this. Conservative enough to signal respectability, expensive enough to reflect his success, boring enough to ensure I wouldn't draw attention away from him. I'd learned to dress like a successful lawyer's wife rather than like myself, another small surrender in the long campaign of becoming who he needed me to be. "You look appropriate," he'd said when I emerged from our bedroom, and I'd felt the familiar sting of being damned with faint praise. Appropriate. Not beautiful, not stunning, not desirable, just appropriate for the role I was meant to play. The evening started predictably enough. Wyatt worked the room with practiced charm while I stood beside him, smiling on cue, making small talk with wives whose names I'd learned to remember, but whose lives remained mysteries to me. We were all variations on the same theme: well-dressed accessories to ambitious men, polished reflections of our husband's status. But everything changed when Abigail arrived. She walked into that room like she owned it, wearing a red dress that should have been too bold for a professional gathering, but somehow managed to look both sophisticated and striking. Her confidence was magnetic in a way that made conversations pause and heads turn, not because she was seeking attention, but because she commanded it naturally. I watched Wyatt's face transform when he spotted her across the room. His smile became genuine for the first time all evening. His posture straightened, his eyes lit up with an intensity I hadn't seen directed at me in years. He excused us from our current conversation and began moving through the crowd toward her like a man with a mission. "Abigail," he said when we reached her, and the warmth in his voice was unmistakable. "You look absolutely stunning." "Thank you," she replied, her smile including both of us, but lingering on him just a moment too long. "Brianna, that dress is lovely. Navy is such a classic choice." Classic. The polite way of saying safe, predictable, forgettable. I smiled and thanked her, playing my part in this performance where everyone knew their lines but me. What followed was an hour of subtle torture disguised as professional networking. Wyatt monopolized Abigail's attention, drawing her into conversations about cases I couldn't follow, legal precedents I'd never heard of, professional gossip that excluded me completely. When other people joined our group, he'd defer to her opinions, showcase her insights, treat her like the brilliant colleague she was, while I stood there holding his drink and nodding at appropriate intervals. "Brianna doesn't work," he explained to a senior partner who'd politely asked what I did. She focuses on supporting my career, making sure I can give my best to the firm. It sounded generous, selfless, like I'd made some noble sacrifice for the greater good. But in that room full of accomplished women, lawyers, judges, business people who'd built their own careers, it felt like an admission of failure. The breaking point came during dinner. We were seated at a table with other partners and their spouses, the kind of carefully orchestrated social situation where every interaction served a professional purpose. Wyatt was deep in conversation with the managing partner about a high-profile case when the topic turned to legal education. "Where did you go to law school?" someone asked me, and the question hung in the air like an accusation. "Oh, Brianna isn't a lawyer," Wyatt interjected smoothly. "She studied psychology in college. Very different field." "Actually," Abigail said, leaning forward with interest, "psychology and law have fascinating intersections. What was your focus, Brianna?" I could feel Wyatt's tension beside me, his subtle wish that this conversation would end quickly. But something rebellious stirred in my chest, a fragment of the woman I used to be, demanding to be heard. "Trauma psychology," I said, meeting Abigail's eyes. I was particularly interested in how psychological manipulation affects victims' ability to recognize and escape abusive situations. The words hung in the air with unexpected weight. I hadn't planned them, hadn't meant to make any kind of statement. But once they were out, I couldn't take them back, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. "That's incredibly important work," Abigail said, and her interest seemed genuine. "Are you still practicing?" Before I could answer, Wyatt's hand found my knee under the table, his fingers pressing just hard enough to signal warning. "Brianna's been focusing on other priorities," he said, his tone carefully neutral, but his grip firm. "We decided together that it made more sense for her to support my career rather than pursue her own." We decided, as if it had been a mutual choice rather than a gradual erosion of my professional identity, a slow-motion suffocation of my ambitions disguised as practical partnership. "That's very generous of you," Brianna said, and her managing partner's wife said, with the kind of smile that could mean anything. "Not everyone is willing to sacrifice their own dreams for their husband's success." Sacrifice. The word hit me like a physical blow, not because it was cruel, but because it was accurate. I had sacrificed my dreams, my career, my sense of purpose, and somehow convinced myself it was love instead of loss. The conversation moved on, but I remained frozen in that moment of recognition. Around me, successful people discussed cases and careers and accomplishments, while I sat there as evidence of roads not taken, potential never realized. I was the cautionary tale disguised as the supportive wife, the woman who'd chosen security over significance and was slowly disappearing into the gap between who I'd been and who I was supposed to become. Later, when Wyatt excused himself to use the restroom, Abigail leaned closer to me across the table. "Can I ask you something?" she said quietly. "Are you happy?" The question was so unexpected, so direct, that I nearly choked on my wine. In 5 years of marriage, through countless social gatherings and dinner parties and professional events, no one had ever asked me that. Not directly, not like it mattered. "Of course," I said automatically, the response so practiced it required no thought. But Abigail's green eyes held mine steadily, and something in her expression suggested she saw through the performance. "Because you seem like someone who has a lot more to offer than this." This? Playing the perfect wife, disappearing into someone else's shadow. She paused, glancing around to make sure we weren't overheard. "You studied trauma psychology. You understand manipulation and control. You must see what's happening here." My heart began beating faster, fight or flight instincts kicking in, as if she'd physically threatened me. Because what she was suggesting felt more dangerous than any accusation, more terrifying than any confrontation. She was suggesting that I still had choices. "I don't know what you mean," I said, but my voice sounded thin, even to my own ears. "I think you do." Abigail's voice was gentle but firm. And I think you deserve better than being treated like an accessory to someone else's life. When Wyatt returned, sliding back into his seat with the proprietary confidence of a man reclaiming his territory, I watched him with new eyes, saw the way he automatically positioned himself between Abigail and me, the way he steered conversations away from topics that might highlight my irrelevance, the way he managed my social interactions like a director staging a play. For the first time in years, I wasn't just experiencing my life, I was observing it. And what I saw made something deep inside me begin to crack, like ice under pressure, ready to shatter into something entirely new. The ride home was quiet, Wyatt scrolling through emails while I stared out the window at the city lights blurring past. But inside my head, Abigail's words echoed with the persistence of a bell that had been struck. You deserve better than being treated like an accessory to someone else's life. For the first time in 5 years, I was beginning to think she might be right. The next morning, Wyatt was in an unusually good mood. He hummed while getting dressed, complimented my coffee, even kissed my forehead before leaving for work. The kind of affectionate gesture that once would have made my whole day, but now felt performative, a reward for playing my role well at the gala. Great event last night, he said, adjusting his tie in the hallway mirror. I think the managing partners were impressed with how we presented ourselves.
We, as if my silence and invisibility had somehow contributed to his professional success rather than simply not interfering with it. Abigail seemed to make quite an impression, I said carefully, testing the waters. His face lit up in a way that confirmed everything I'd suspected. She's remarkable, isn't she? The partners are already talking about fast-tracking her to senior associate. Brilliant legal mind. I nodded, pouring myself more coffee to have something to do with my hands. She asked me about my psychology background. Did she? Wyatt's tone shifted slightly, became more guarded. What did you tell her? Just about my interest in trauma psychology. She seemed genuinely curious about the field. There was a pause, and I watched him calculate his response. You know, sweetheart, I've been thinking about our conversation last night, about your old interests. Maybe it would be good for you to find a hobby, something to keep you occupied during the day. A hobby? He was offering me a hobby, like I was a restless housewife who needed activities to fill her empty hours, rather than a woman who'd once had professional aspirations and intellectual ambitions. What kind of hobby? I asked. I don't know. Yoga classes, maybe? Or that pottery studio downtown. Something relaxing, not too demanding. You've seemed a little unsettled lately. Unsettled, his code word for any behavior that deviated from the compliant, grateful persona he'd cultivated in me over 5 years of marriage. Actually, I said, the words forming before I'd fully thought them through, I've been thinking about volunteering, maybe at the women's shelter downtown. They could probably use someone with a psychology background. The suggestion hung between us like a challenge. I hadn't planned to say it, but once the words were out, they felt right. More right than anything I'd said in months. Wyatt's expression tightened, almost imperceptibly. The women's shelter? Brianna, that's a pretty intense environment. Are you sure you're ready for that kind of emotional weight? There it was again, the gentle undermining disguised as concern. The subtle message that I wasn't strong enough, wise enough, stable enough to handle real responsibility. I think I could help, I said quietly. I understand trauma responses, manipulation tactics. I know what it feels like to lose yourself gradually, to not recognize the person you've become. The words came out more pointed than I'd intended, and I saw Wyatt's jaw tighten slightly. But instead of backing down, something stubborn hardened in my chest. I'm not sure that's the best idea, he said carefully. Those situations can be very triggering, especially for someone as sensitive as you. And honestly, sweetheart, you don't have any practical experience with actual abuse cases. It might be presumptuous to think you could help. Presumptuous, another careful word choice, designed to make me doubt myself, to step back into the safe boundaries he'd drawn around my life. But something had shifted since last night, since Abigail's direct question about my happiness.
since watching myself from the outside and recognizing the cage I'd built around my own potential. "I'm going to call them today," I said, meeting his eyes steadily, "just to inquire about volunteer opportunities." For a moment, his mask slipped. I saw a flash of something sharp and controlling, the real Wyatt who lived beneath the charming exterior, but it was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. "Of course," he said, his smile returning like a switch had been flipped. "If that's what you really want, just promise me you'll be careful. I worry about you." I worry about you. His favorite manipulation, the one that made his control sound like love, his restrictions feel like protection. After he left, I sat at the kitchen counter with my phone in my hands, staring at the number for the Rideside Women's Center. It would be so easy to not call, to find reasons to postpone, to let this moment of rebellion fade into another day of compliant routine. Instead, I dialed. "Rideside Women's Center, this is Selma." I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "I'm calling about volunteer opportunities. I have a background in psychology, and I'd like to help if I can." "That's wonderful. Can you come in this week for an orientation meeting? We always need people who understand trauma response." "Yes," I said without hesitation. "I'd like that very much." As I hung up, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with Wyatt's needs or approval. It was a small step, maybe insignificant in the larger scope of my life, but it felt like reclaiming a piece of territory I'd ceded long ago. The orientation meeting was scheduled for Thursday afternoon. I didn't tell Wyatt about the specific time, just mentioned that I'd be out running errands. A small deception, but it felt like practicing for larger ones. The center was housed in an unmarkable building downtown, the kind of place you might walk past without noticing. But inside, it hummed with quiet purpose. Women moved through the halls with the particular intensity of people doing work that mattered, and I felt something stir in my chest that I'd almost forgotten existed, the desire to be useful in a way that had nothing to do with managing someone else's comfort. Selma Weaver turned out to be a woman in her 50s with graying hair and the kind of direct gaze that missed nothing. She walked me through the center's programs, explained their approach to supporting survivors, and asked about my background with a thoroughness that reminded me what it felt like to be taken seriously as a professional rather than dismissed as someone's wife. "Your psychology training would be valuable in our support groups," she said, reviewing my hastily assembled resume. "But I have to ask, do you have any personal experience with domestic violence or psychological abuse?" The question caught me off guard. I'd expected to discuss my academic background, my theoretical knowledge of trauma response and recovery. I hadn't expected to examine my own life under that particular lens. I started, then stopped. Did I? Wyatt had never hit me, never screamed at me, never threatened me with physical violence. He'd never isolated me from friends and family, not overtly, not in ways that could be called abusive. Except he had, hadn't he? Just more subtly, more palatably, through gentle discouragement instead of outright prohibition, through concern that felt like care but functioned like control. "I think," I said carefully, "I'm beginning to understand some patterns I hadn't recognized before." Selma nodded, and something in her expression suggested she'd heard similar realizations before. That's often how it starts, recognition. The work here can be emotionally challenging, especially when it mirrors your own experience. Are you prepared for that? Was I? I thought about Wyatt's reaction that morning, his careful efforts to discourage this new direction without seeming controlling. I thought about 5 years of shrinking myself to fit his vision of who I should be, of accepting limitations that felt like protection until you realized they were prison bars. "I think I need to be," I said. She smiled for the first time since I'd arrived. "Then let's talk about getting you started." Walking out of that building an hour later, I felt different. Not transformed, not suddenly empowered, but awake in a way I hadn't done for years. Like someone had turned up the brightness on my life just enough to see details I'd been missing. I had training sessions scheduled, support groups to observe, a chance to use skills I'd thought were buried forever. It wasn't revolution, but it was a beginning. And beginnings, I was starting to remember, could be more powerful than endings. Working at the Women's Center changed something fundamental in how I saw the world. Not dramatically, not all at once, but like adjusting your eyes to different light until details that were always there suddenly become visible. During my first week of training, I sat in on support groups and listened to women tell stories that felt uncomfortably familiar. Not the dramatic narratives I'd expected, screaming fights, visible bruises, obvious threats, but quieter tales of erosion. Women who described feeling like they were disappearing, losing pieces of themselves so gradually they hadn't noticed until almost nothing remained. "He never hit me," said a woman named Elena during one session, her voice barely above a whisper. "But he had opinions about everything. My clothes, my friends, how I spent my time. Always presented as suggestions, as concern for my well-being. Until one day, I realized I couldn't remember the last decision I'd made without checking with him first. I found myself nodding before I realized what I was doing. The other women in the circle noticed, their eyes settling on me with a recognition I wasn't ready to acknowledge. "It starts so small," added another woman. "A comment here, a suggestion there. Before you know it, you're living someone else's life and calling it love." After the session, Selma pulled me aside. "How are you processing this, Brianna? Sometimes volunteers find the work more personally relevant than they initially expected." I wanted to deflect, to maintain the professional distance I'd assumed would protect me. Instead, I found myself saying, "I think I'm recognizing some patterns." She nodded, settling into the chair across from me. "Want to talk about it?" So I did. Not everything, not all at once, but enough. The way Wyatt framed his control as protection, the gradual shrinking of my world until it revolved entirely around his needs and preferences. The way I'd learned to anticipate his moods, to avoid topics that might displease him, to present only the version of myself he found acceptable. "It sounds like you're describing emotional abuse," Selma said quietly when I finished. The words hit me like a physical blow. Abuse felt like too strong a term for my marriage, too dramatic for the subtle erosion I'd experienced. Abuse happened to other women, women who ended up in shelters, women whose situations were obviously dangerous. "I don't think it's that serious," I said quickly. "He's never hurt me physically. He provides for me. He's successful. Brianna." Selma's voice was gentle but firm. "Abuse isn't just physical violence. It's any pattern of behavior designed to control another person. What you're describing, the isolation, the financial control, the constant criticism disguised as concern, those are classic tactics." I stared at her, feeling the ground shift beneath everything I'd believed about my life. If what she was saying was true, then I wasn't just an unhappy wife. I was a victim, and that word felt impossible to apply to myself. "But I chose this," I said weakly. "I chose to get married, to support his career, to—" "Did you choose it, or were you gradually conditioned to accept it?" Selma asked. "There's a difference between making informed decisions and being systematically manipulated into compliance." That night, I drove home in a daze. The familiar streets looked different, like I was seeing my own neighborhood through new eyes. When I pulled into our driveway, I sat in the car for several minutes, staring at the house Wyatt had chosen and the neighborhood he preferred, decorated according to his tastes. When had I stopped having preferences of my own? Wyatt was in his office when I got inside, door closed, voice muffled by what sounded like a phone call. I could hear laughter, both his and someone else's, a woman's voice I recognized as Abigail's. They were working late again, collaborating on another case, spending more time together than Wyatt and I did. I stood in the hallway, listening to my husband laugh with another woman, and for the first time, I wasn't hurt by it. I was calculating. Because if Selma was right, if I was indeed in an abusive relationship, then Wyatt's affair wasn't just a betrayal, it was an opportunity. A chance to document his deception, to build a case for why I deserved more than the crumbs he'd been offering me for 5 years. That night, after Wyatt finally emerged from his office and went through his usual bedtime routine without asking about my day, I lay awake thinking about evidence, not in the abstract way I'd learned about it in college, but in practical terms. What could I document? What patterns could I establish? What proof could I gather that would speak louder than his inevitable denials? The next morning, I started a journal, not the pretty kind with inspirational quotes, but a plain notebook I could hide easily. I recorded the time Wyatt got home, whether he mentioned where he'd been, any inconsistencies in his stories. I noted the times he criticized my appearance, questioned my judgment, or made decisions without consulting me. It felt strange at first, like spying on my own life. But as the days passed and the entries accumulated, patterns emerged that were impossible to ignore. The frequency of his late meetings, the way he dismissed my opinions while praising Abigail's insights, the gradual escalation of his controlling behaviors as he became more confident in his affair. 3 weeks into my volunteer work, I had my first breakthrough moment. I was co-facilitating a support group when a new member, a woman who'd been married for 15 years, broke down crying. "I just feel so stupid," she sobbed. "How did I let this happen? How did I become this person?" Without thinking, I found myself speaking. "You're not stupid. You were systematically conditioned to accept unacceptable treatment. It's not weakness, it's survival. Your brain adapted to protect you from constant conflict by becoming hypervigilant to his moods and needs. That's not stupidity. That's trauma response." The room went quiet. Even Selma looked surprised by my intervention. But the woman stopped crying, looked up at me with something like hope in her eyes. "You really think so?" "I know so," I said, and realized I was talking to myself as much as to her. You survived by becoming what he needed you to be, but surviving isn't the same as living, and you deserve to live. After the session, Selma approached me again. That was remarkably insightful. You seemed to understand her experience on a very personal level. "I think I'm starting to understand a lot of things," I said. That evening, I came home to find Wyatt in an unusually good mood. He'd brought flowers, not because it was a special occasion, but because he'd had a good day at work. The kind of spontaneous gesture that once would have thrilled me, but now felt calculated, a reward for my recent compliance. "How was your volunteer work?" he asked over dinner. The question casual, but his attention focused.
Educational, I said carefully. I'm learning a lot about trauma response and recovery patterns. He nodded, cutting his steak with precise movements. That's nice, sweetheart. Just remember not to get too emotionally involved. These women's situations are very different from yours. Are they? I wondered, but didn't say aloud. Instead, I smiled and agreed, playing the role he expected, while my mind cataloged another entry for my journal. Husband dismisses volunteer work, suggests I'm too emotionally fragile for meaningful responsibility. Later that night, while Wyatt was in the shower, I checked his phone. The second device was gone. He'd learned to be more careful after I'd stumbled across it that first time. But his regular phone showed recent calls to Abigail's number, long conversations that happened while he was supposedly working late. I didn't feel hurt anymore. I felt focused. Because I was beginning to understand that this wasn't just about infidelity. It was about power, control, and the systematic destruction of my identity to serve his needs. And for the first time in 5 years, I was starting to remember who I used to be before I learned to disappear. The woman who'd wanted to help trauma survivors recover from abuse was still inside me. She'd just been waiting for the right moment to wake up and realize she needed to save herself first. My documentation became methodical, almost scientific. I approached it the way I'd once approached research papers in graduate school, building a case piece by careful piece. The journal entries were just the beginning. I started taking pictures of receipts I found in Wyatt's pockets, expensive dinners for two at restaurants we'd never been to together, hotel charges from business trips that supposedly involved client meetings but seemed to include room service champagne and late checkout times. I photographed the credit card statements that showed patterns of spending I couldn't account for, jewelry purchases, luxury boutique charges, spa treatments I'd never received.
The most damning evidence came from his laptop. Wyatt was careless with passwords, using the same combination of letters and numbers for everything. While he was at his Saturday morning tennis game, I accessed his email accounts and found months of correspondence with Abigail that went far beyond professional collaboration. "Last night was perfect," read one email from 3 weeks ago. "I can't stop thinking about you." "The conference in Boston will be the perfect cover," wrote another. 3 days, just us. "She's becoming suspicious about the late nights. We need to be more careful until I can figure out how to handle this situation." Handle this situation. That's what I'd become in his mind. Not a wife, not a person with feelings and rights, but a situation to be managed until he could dispose of me in whatever way served his interests best. I printed everything, stored physical copies in a safety deposit box I'd opened under my maiden name, and uploaded digital backups to a cloud account Wyatt didn't know existed. If he was building towards some dramatic revelation, some calculated destruction of our marriage that painted him as the victim, I would be ready. But it wasn't just about gathering evidence of his affair. Through my work at the Women's Center, I was learning about financial abuse, about the ways controlling partners use money as a weapon. With Selma's guidance, I began to understand how thoroughly Wyatt had isolated me from our financial reality. I requested credit reports and discovered accounts I didn't know existed. I researched our investment portfolio and found that everything was in his name only. The house, the cars, the savings accounts, even my own jewelry was technically his property since he'd purchased it. In the eyes of the law, I owned almost nothing despite 5 years of marriage. "This is very common," Selma explained when I showed her my findings. "Financial abuse often involves preventing the victim from building independent wealth or credit. It creates dependency that makes leaving seem impossible." She was right. If Wyatt decided to divorce me tomorrow, I'd be left with virtually nothing. No recent work history, no independent income, no assets in my name. It was a trap so elegant I'd never seen it being built around me. "But you're not powerless," Selma continued. "You're educated, you're intelligent, and now you're aware. That's more than many women have when they start planning their exit." Exit. The word should have terrified me, but instead, it felt like possibility, like hope. That's when I started thinking strategically about my own future. I opened a bank account at a different institution using my maiden name, funding it with small cash withdrawals that wouldn't show up on our joint account statements. $20 here, $50 there, money I claimed was for coffee or groceries, but went directly into what I'd started thinking of as my freedom fund. I began updating my resume, reaching out to former professors and classmates, researching graduate programs and career opportunities, not because I was planning to leave, not yet, but because I was planning to be able to leave. There's a profound difference between those two positions, and it changes everything about how you move through the world. The volunteer work became more than just documentation of Wyatt's patterns. It became training for my own recovery. I learned about safety planning, about the practical steps women take when they're ready to reclaim their lives. I studied the legal aspects of domestic violence cases, the way courts evaluate evidence of emotional abuse, the financial protections available to victims. Most importantly, I learned that what I was experiencing wasn't unusual or shameful. It was textbook psychological manipulation, executed by someone sophisticated enough to make it seem like love. The isolation, the financial control, the gradual erosion of my self-worth, these were deliberate tactics, not accidental byproducts of a difficult marriage. Understanding this changed how I interacted with Wyatt. I stopped taking his criticisms personally because I recognized them as tools designed to keep me compliant. I stopped feeling grateful for his generosity because I understood it was calculated control. I stopped apologizing for taking up space because I realized that making me feel like a burden was part of his strategy. The most dangerous part was that I had to hide this awakening from him. I couldn't let him see that I was changing, growing stronger, becoming someone who might challenge his authority. So I played my role more carefully than ever, presenting the facade of the grateful, dependent wife while quietly building the foundation for something entirely different. "You seem happier lately," he commented one evening, and I could hear the question underneath the observation. "The volunteer work is fulfilling," I said, which was true but incomplete. What was really fulfilling was remembering who I used to be, reclaiming pieces of myself I'd thought were gone forever. "I'm glad you found something that makes you feel useful," he replied, and the condescension in his voice no longer stung. Instead, it went straight into my mental catalog of evidence, another example of how he viewed me as less than equal, less than human. 3 months into my documentation project, I had enough evidence to prove adultery, financial abuse, and systematic psychological manipulation. I had the beginnings of an independent life, resources he didn't know about, support systems he couldn't control. But I also had something more valuable than evidence. I had clarity. I understood now that Wyatt hadn't fallen in love with Abigail despite being happily married to me. He'd pursued her because she represented everything he'd systematically discouraged me from being: confident, accomplished, intellectually engaging. He'd created the very deficiencies in me that he now used to justify his betrayal. It was brilliant in its cruelty, and it was about to backfire spectacularly. Because the woman he'd spent 5 years diminishing, the wife he thought he could manipulate and discard at his convenience, was no longer the same person who'd walked down the aisle believing marriage meant surrender. I was someone entirely different now, someone who understood the game, who'd learned the rules, who'd been quietly building her own strategy while he congratulated himself on his superior planning. Valentine's Day was 6 weeks away. Based on his recent behavior, the increased late nights, the expensive purchases, the weekend work retreats, I suspected he was building towards some grand gesture, some dramatic revelation that would let him play the role of the unsatisfied husband who'd finally found true love with a more suitable partner. He thought he was writing the ending to our story. What he didn't realize was that I'd been writing a completely different story all along. And in my version, the woman who'd been underestimated for 5 years was about to remind everyone exactly what she was capable of when she stopped pretending to be helpless. The only question was whether I was ready to show him just how much I'd learned from the best teacher he could have given me, himself. My sister Diane noticed the change first. We were having coffee at a small cafe downtown, our first real conversation in months, when she leaned back in her chair and studied my face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "You look different," she said finally, "more present." I'd been careful to maintain my usual facade at home, but apparently the changes were more visible than I'd realized. Different how? "I don't know, like you're actually here instead of just going through the motions." She paused, stirring her latte thoughtfully. "When's the last time we talked about something other than Wyatt's career or what he needed from you?" The question hit me like a revelation. I couldn't remember. Our conversations for the past 5 years had been carefully edited versions of my life, sanitized to avoid any topics that might reflect poorly on my marriage or suggest I was anything less than completely fulfilled. "You're right," I said, and the admission felt liberating. "I've been finding myself again, I guess." "Through the volunteer work?" "Partly. I considered how much to share, how much truth our relationship could handle after years of careful omissions. I'm learning things about psychology, about trauma and recovery. It's making me see patterns I missed before." Diane's expression sharpened. She'd always been the more perceptive of us, the one who noticed details others overlooked. "Patterns in other people's lives or your own?" The directness of her question caught me off guard, but something in her tone suggested she'd been waiting years to ask it. "Both," I said quietly. She nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she'd long suspected. "Brianna, I need to tell you something I probably should have said years ago. I never liked how Wyatt treated you. The way he'd dismiss your opinions, interrupt you, make decisions without asking what you wanted. It wasn't normal, and it wasn't okay." Hearing it from someone who loved me, stated so simply and clearly, made something crack open in my chest. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because you seemed happy, or at least you said you were happy, and I was afraid if I pushed, you'd just pull away completely." She reached across the table and took my hand. "But you weren't happy, were you?" The tears came without warning. 5 years of suppressed grief spilling out in a quiet coffee shop while my sister held my hand and waited for me to find my voice. "No," I whispered. "I wasn't. I'm not." That conversation led to another, and then another. Diane became my ally in ways I hadn't expected, offering not just emotional support, but practical assistance. She helped me research divorce attorneys, understand my legal options, and develop strategies for protecting myself financially. "You need someone who specializes in cases involving emotional abuse," she said, sliding a business card across her kitchen table. "Elaine Ames. She's supposed to be brilliant at exposing manipulation tactics in court." Elaine Ames turned out to be exactly what I needed, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who listened to my story without judgment and immediately understood the complexity of my situation. "Your husband is very smart," she said, after reviewing the evidence I'd collected. "This level of financial control, combined with the systematic isolation and psychological manipulation, demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of how to maintain power in a relationship." "Is it enough?" I asked. "For a divorce, I mean. Will a court recognize emotional abuse if there was no physical violence?" "Absolutely, especially with documentation this thorough." She gestured to the files I'd brought. "The pattern is clear, the evidence is comprehensive, and the affair provides additional grounds. But I have to ask, what are you hoping to achieve here?" It was a good question, one I'd been grappling with for weeks. "I want out. I want my life back, and I want him to understand that he can't just discard people when they're no longer useful to him." "Those are all reasonable goals, but you need to be prepared for him to fight back. Men like your husband don't accept losing control gracefully. He'll likely try to paint you as unstable, ungrateful, or vindictive. He'll use every manipulation tactic he's perfected over 5 years of marriage." "I know," I said, and realized I meant it. "But I'm not the same person I was when this started. I understand his methods now. I won't be caught off guard." Elaine smiled for the first time since I'd arrived. "Then, let's talk strategy." What followed was the most empowering conversation I'd had in years. We discussed asset protection, spousal support, the legal precedents for cases involving financial abuse. Elaine explained how courts evaluate evidence of psychological manipulation, what documentation would be most compelling, how to present my case in ways that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. "The key," she said, "is showing the pattern rather than focusing on individual incidents. Anyone can have bad days or make cruel comments. What you're documenting is systematic behavior designed to control and diminish you." She also connected me with other resources: a forensic accountant who could trace hidden assets, a therapist who specialized in helping abuse survivors prepare for legal proceedings, even a private investigator who could fill in gaps in my evidence if needed. "I don't want this to be about revenge," I told her. "I want it to be about justice." "Sometimes they're the same thing," Elaine replied. "Justice for someone who's been systematically abused often looks like consequences for the abuser. Don't apologize for wanting him to face the full impact of his choices." That weekend, while Wyatt was at another work conference with Abigail, I met with the forensic accountant. What we discovered was even worse than I'd suspected. Hidden accounts, diverted funds, investments I'd never known existed, all carefully structured to ensure I'd have no claim to assets that should have been marital property. "He's been planning this for a while," the accountant explained, showing me financial records dating back 2 years. "This level of asset protection doesn't happen overnight. He's been systematically moving money and restructuring investments to minimize what you'd receive in a divorce." The betrayal went deeper than an affair. Wyatt had been planning to leave me long before he'd met Abigail, carefully arranging our finances to ensure I'd be left with as little as possible. The cruelty was breathtaking in its calculation. But knowledge is power, and now I had both. I understood exactly what he'd been doing, how he'd been doing it, and most importantly, how to prove it in court. His careful planning would become evidence of his systematic abuse. His financial manipulation would demonstrate his willingness to harm me for his own benefit. "Can we recover the hidden assets?" I asked. "Most of them, yes. The courts don't look kindly on spouses who try to hide marital property. With this level of documentation, we can make a strong case for not just recovery, but punitive damages. 3 days before Valentine's Day, Elaine called with an update that made everything click into place. My investigator confirmed that your husband has reservations for 2 at Les Bernardins on Valentine's night, she said, the same restaurant where he proposed. Based on the intel we've gathered about his recent purchases, jewelry, flowers, champagne, it looks like he's planning some kind of grand gesture. He's going to ask for a divorce, I said, the pieces falling into place. In public, at a romantic restaurant, probably framing it as some noble sacrifice so he can be with his true love. That would be my assessment. He's setting the stage to be the sympathetic party, the man who finally found the courage to follow his heart. I thought about Spencer's earlier comments about their bet regarding my emotional breakdown. This wasn't just about leaving me. It was about humiliating me, proving to his friends that I was as weak and dependent as he'd always claimed. He thinks I'll break down, I said, that I'll beg him to stay, make a scene, give him exactly the reaction he's counting on to justify everything he's done. Will you? For the first time in months, I smiled with genuine confidence. No, I won't. Because I had something Wyatt didn't know about: complete documentation of his abuse, professional legal representation, and most importantly, the strength that comes from understanding exactly who you're fighting and why. Valentine's Day was going to be very different from what he was expecting. The morning of February 14th, I woke up feeling strangely calm. Not the artificial calm I'd perfected over 5 years of walking on eggshells, but something deeper: the quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly where you stand and what you're prepared to do about it. Wyatt was already up, humming in the shower with the particular energy he displayed when he thought something exciting was about to happen. I lay in bed listening to him prepare for what he believed would be his triumphant moment, and felt nothing but detached curiosity about how the evening would unfold. "Good morning, beautiful," he said when he emerged, toweling his hair with the kind of performative affection that had once made my heart race. Now I recognized it for what it was: the behavior of someone who needed me to be in a good mood for whatever he had planned. "Happy Valentine's Day," I replied, injecting just the right amount of warmth into my voice. The woman he expected to see, grateful and unsuspecting. He'd bought me flowers, roses, predictably, and had them delivered to the house with a card that read, "Looking forward to our special evening. All my love, W." The message felt like a goodbye, disguised as romance, a final gesture before the execution. I arranged them in a vase and took a picture, thinking my lawyer would find it interesting evidence of his elaborate staging. Then I went about my morning routine as if this were any other day, while mentally reviewing the plan I'd spent weeks perfecting. My phone buzzed with a text from Diane. "Remember, you're stronger than you know. I'm proud of you." Another from Elaine. "Everything is ready on our end. Trust yourself." And surprisingly, one from Selma at the Women's Center. "Thinking of you today. You've got this."
Having people who believed in me, who saw my worth when I'd forgotten it myself, made all the difference. For 5 years, Wyatt had been my primary source of validation, and he'd used that power to keep me small. Now I had a network of support that existed entirely outside his influence. I spent the afternoon at the salon, getting my hair done and my nails manicured, not because Wyatt had asked me to, but because I wanted to look polished for what was coming. I chose a deep red lipstick, the color he'd once criticized as too attention-seeking, and smiled at my reflection. The woman looking back at me wasn't the diminished wife who'd learned to disappear into the background. She was someone who understood her own worth and was prepared to fight for it. At 4 o'clock, I received the call I'd been expecting. "Darling, I'm running late at the office." Wyatt's voice was carefully casual. "Why don't you meet me at Le Bernardin at 7? I've got our usual table reserved." Our usual table, where he'd proposed, where we'd celebrated anniversaries, where he now planned to end our marriage in the most public, humiliating way possible. "Of course," I said sweetly. "I'll see you there."
After hanging up, I sat in our bedroom, soon to be his bedroom, and opened the small velvet box I'd been hiding in my jewelry drawer. Inside was my grandmother's engagement ring, the one she'd worn for 60 years of genuine marriage. I'd never worn it because Wyatt preferred the ring he'd chosen, the one that reflected his taste rather than my family history. Tonight felt like the right time to honor the woman who'd taught me that love shouldn't diminish you. I dressed carefully in a black dress I'd bought specifically for this evening, not the conservative styles Wyatt preferred, but something that made me feel powerful, strong, ready for battle. As I was putting on my coat, my phone rang. Spencer's name flashed on the screen, and after a moment's hesitation, I answered. "Brianna, just wanted to wish you a happy Valentine's Day." His voice was artificially cheerful, like someone trying too hard to sound casual. "Hope you and Wyatt have a wonderful evening." "Thank you, Spencer. That's very thoughtful of you." There was a pause, and I could practically hear him calculating his next words. "You know, I might stop by Le Bernardin later tonight. I know how much Wyatt loves that place." Of course he would. This was more than just a divorce. It was entertainment. Spencer wanted a front row seat to watch me fall apart, to see his bet with Wyatt proven right. "How lovely," I said, my voice perfectly pleasant. "I'm sure Wyatt would enjoy seeing you." After I hung up, I stood in my hallway mirror and practiced my smile one last time. Not the brittle, performative smile I'd perfected as Wyatt's wife, but something genuine, something that belonged entirely to me. Then I picked up the small wrapped box from my dresser, my own Valentine's gift from my husband, and headed out to meet my fate. The drive to the restaurant felt like the longest and shortest 20 minutes of my life. My heart was steady, my hands calm on the steering wheel. I'd spent months preparing for this moment, building my case piece by careful piece. Now all that remained was the execution. As I pulled up to Le Bernardin, I could see Wyatt through the window at our usual table, checking his watch with the particular tension of someone's carefully orchestrated plan was about to unfold. He had no idea that his unsuspecting victim had become the architect of his downfall. It was time to show him exactly how much he'd underestimated the woman he thought he'd broken. Wyatt stood as I approached the table, his smile broad and confident. He looked like a man who believed he was about to deliver an Academy Award-winning performance, someone so certain of the outcome that he was already savoring his victory. "You look stunning," he said, pulling out my chair with the exaggerated courtesy of someone performing for an audience he couldn't see yet. "That dress is different." Different, his code word for anything that deviated from his carefully curated vision of who I should be. But tonight, I heard it as a compliment. "Thank you," I said, settling into my seat and noticing how he'd positioned himself with a clear view of the restaurant entrance. Expecting someone, perhaps? The sommelier appeared with champagne, Dom Perignon, the same brand from our wedding. Wyatt had clearly put thought into the symbolism, crafting this evening like a director staging his masterpiece. "To us," he said, raising his glass with theatrical flourish. "To 5 wonderful years and to whatever comes next." Whatever comes next. Even his toasts were loaded with hidden meaning now, breadcrumbs leading to his grand reveal. I clinked my glass against his and took a small sip, watching him over the rim. His confidence was intoxicating, not to me, but to him. He practically vibrated with self-satisfaction, a man convinced of his own brilliance. "You seem excited about something," I observed, keeping my voice light and curious. "Just happy to be here with you," he replied, but his eyes kept darting to his phone, checking the time, monitoring the entrance. This place holds so many memories for us. Indeed it did. Our engagement, anniversary dinners, celebrations of his career milestones. Always his achievements, I realize now. When had we last celebrated something of mine? "Spencer texted me earlier," I mentioned casually. "He said he might stop by tonight." Wyatt's smile flickered for just a moment before brightening. "Did he? That's unexpected." Unexpected, right, because having a witness to my humiliation had definitely not been part of his plan. The first course arrived, and Wyatt launched into animated conversation about work, clearly building towards something. His voice carried that particular quality it had when he was performing for others, louder, more confident, designed to draw attention. Abigail finished the Morrison brief today, he said, and the way her name rolled off his tongue was different now. Intimate, possessive. Brilliant work, as always. She has this way of seeing angles that completely change how you approach a case. She sounds remarkable, I said, and meant it. Abigail was remarkable, in ways that had nothing to do with Wyatt's fantasy of her. She is. His smile was dreamy now, the expression of a man in love who'd forgotten he was supposed to be hiding it. You know, Brianna, I've been thinking about us lately, about what we both deserve in life. Here it comes, I thought, setting down my fork and giving him my full attention, the opening act of his carefully scripted drama. What do you mean? I asked, playing the unsuspecting wife to perfection. Well, we're both still young. We both have so much life ahead of us, and I wonder sometimes if we're really living up to our potential together. The language was careful, therapeutic almost. He'd probably practiced this speech, refined it to sound reasonable rather than cruel. Poor Wyatt, trapped in a marriage that was holding both of us back from our true happiness. Are you saying you're not happy? I asked, allowing just a touch of concern to color my voice. It's not that simple, he replied, leaning forward with the earnest expression of someone about to deliver difficult but necessary truth. I care about you deeply, Brianna. I always will. But lately I've been wondering if caring about someone is the same as being in love with them. Spencer appeared at our table as if summoned by the dramatic timing. Well, well, what do we have here? He said, sliding into an empty chair without being invited. The happy couple on Valentine's Day. His grin was predatory, the expression of someone about to witness blood sport. I wondered how much money was riding on my reaction, how detailed their bet had been about the specifics of my breakdown. Spencer, Wyatt said, and I caught the slight tightness around his eyes. This interruption wasn't quite going according to plan. I didn't expect to see you tonight, Spencer replied, signaling the waiter for a drink. This is such a special place for you two, isn't it? So many memories. The subtext was clear. This was about to become another memory, one they'd both remember fondly as the night Wyatt finally grew a spine and ditched his pathetic wife. We were just having a conversation about the future, Wyatt continued, his smile widening. How exciting! What kind of future are we talking about? I watched this performance with the detached interest of someone observing a play she'd already read. These two men, so pleased with their own cleverness, so certain they understood how this story would end. I was telling Brianna that I think we both deserve to be truly happy, Wyatt said, his voice gaining strength as he warmed to his theme. That sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone you care about is be honest about what you need. And what do you need, Wyatt? Spencer asked, leaning back in his chair like he was settling in for the main event. Wyatt reached across the table and took my hand, his touch gentle but practiced, the gesture of a man about to deliver a devastating blow while maintaining the moral high ground. I need to be authentic, he said, his voice carrying perfectly to nearby tables. I need to stop pretending that settling for comfortable is the same as choosing love. There it was, the setup for his grand finale, the moment when he'd reveal his affair as noble honesty rather than selfish betrayal, when he'd paint me as the obstacle to his authentic happiness and Abigail as his salvation. I squeezed his hand gently and smiled. I completely agree, I said.
The silence that followed my words was profound. Not the comfortable quiet of understanding, but the sharp-edged stillness that comes when a carefully constructed script suddenly derails. Wyatt blinked at me, his confident expression wavering as he tried to process what I'd just said. This wasn't the response he'd rehearsed for. I was supposed to look confused, maybe a little hurt, asking him to explain what he meant. I wasn't supposed to agree. You agree? He said carefully. Absolutely.
You deserve to be authentic. You deserve to stop settling for comfortable. You deserve to be with someone who truly appreciates your brilliance. I took a sip of champagne, enjoying the way both men stared at me like I'd started speaking a foreign language. In fact, I brought you something tonight that I think you'll find very authentic. I reached into my purse and withdrew a small wrapped box, placing it gently on the table between us. The red ribbon caught the candlelight, making it look almost festive. "What's this?" Wyatt asked, his voice slightly hoarse. "Your Valentine's gift, of course. Open it." Spencer leaned forward, his earlier confidence replaced by confusion. This wasn't the entertainment he'd been promised. The woman who was supposed to break down sobbing was instead presenting gifts and smiling serenely. Wyatt's hands trembled slightly as he unwrapped the box. Inside was a leather folder, elegant and expensive looking. He opened it, and I watched his face change as he read the first line. "Petition for dissolution of marriage," he read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. "I filed it this morning," I said conversationally. "I thought Valentine's Day was the perfect time for new beginnings, don't you?" The blood drained from his face as he flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning legal terms and financial disclosures that clearly weren't what he'd expected to see. "But how did you?" he stammered, then looked up at me with something approaching panic. "Brianna, what is this?" "It's exactly what you wanted," I replied calmly. "Freedom from a marriage that was holding us both back from our authentic selves. I'm giving you what you've been planning to ask for." Spencer's mouth fell open. "Planning to ask for?" "Oh yes," I said, turning to include him in the conversation. "Wyatt's been preparing to divorce me for months, haven't you, darling? All those late nights with Abigail, the financial restructuring, the careful asset protection. Very thorough work, really." Wyatt's face went white, then red, then white again. "How do you know about Abigail? About the hidden accounts? About the Boston conference where you told her you were planning to handle the situation with your inconvenient wife?" I smiled pleasantly. "I know about all of it, Wyatt. Everything." I reached into my purse again and placed a second folder on the table. This one was thicker, more official looking. "Financial disclosure documents," I explained helpfully. "Bank records, email correspondence, hotel receipts, credit card statements, a complete record of your affair and your attempts to hide marital assets. My lawyer was very impressed with how thorough you were in documenting your own deception." Spencer pushed back from the table slightly, as if trying to distance himself from what was happening. "Wyatt, what the hell is she talking about?" But Wyatt wasn't listening to Spencer anymore. He was staring at the documents in front of him, his carefully constructed world crumbling in real time. "You can't do this," he said, his voice cracking. "You don't understand the legal implications. You'll get nothing. I've made sure of that." "Actually, I'll get quite a lot." I took another sip of champagne, noting how the other diners were starting to notice our table. Turns out courts don't look favorably on spouses who engage in systematic financial abuse while conducting affairs. Who knew? "Financial abuse?" Spencer echoed, looking genuinely shocked. "It's a serious crime," I corrected. "Isolating a spouse from financial resources, hiding assets, preventing them from building independent wealth or credit. The documentation is quite extensive." I pulled out my phone and showed them a photo of Wyatt's hidden device, the one with months of text messages to Abigail. "This is my favorite piece of evidence," I said conversationally. "The part where you discuss how oblivious I am, how I'm not the confrontational type. You were right about one thing, Wyatt. I wasn't confrontational, but I was paying attention." The restaurant around us had grown quieter, other diners sensing the drama unfolding at our table. Wyatt seemed to realize this, his eyes darting around nervously. "Brianna, please," he said, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "Can we discuss this privately? You're making a scene." "Am I?" I looked around innocently. I thought I was just having dinner with my husband on Valentine's Day, celebrating new beginnings, authentic relationships, the courage to pursue true happiness. Isn't that what you wanted? Spencer cleared his throat awkwardly. Maybe I should. Oh no, please stay, I said warmly. After all, you had a bet riding on tonight's outcome, didn't you? Something about how I'd react when Wyatt served me divorce papers? I'd hate for you to miss the conclusion. Spencer's face went pale. How did you. The hallway has excellent acoustics, I said simply. I heard everything. The bet, the planning, your confidence that I'd crumble completely. Women are so predictable, right? I stood up slowly, gathering my purse and coat with deliberate calm. Both men stared at me as if I'd transformed into someone they'd never seen before, which, in a way, I had. You're leaving? Wyatt asked, his voice cracking with disbelief. But we haven't. We need to discuss this. We need to figure out. What's to discuss? I asked pleasantly, slipping my coat over my shoulders. You wanted authenticity. You wanted to stop settling. You wanted to be with someone who truly appreciates your brilliance. Well, now you can be. Brianna, wait. He half stood from his chair, reaching for my arm. This isn't how this was supposed to go. No, I agreed, stepping back from his grasp. It's not. You were supposed to blindside me with divorce papers while Spencer watched me fall apart. I was supposed to beg you to stay, maybe make a scene that would justify everything you've done. But here's the thing about psychological manipulation, Wyatt. Once someone understands how it works, it stops working. The entire restaurant was watching now, conversations hushed as diners strained to hear our exchange. I could see phones being discreetly held up, probably recording what looked like prime social media content. The humiliation Wyatt had planned for me was happening to him instead, and the irony wasn't lost on me. You can't just walk away, Spencer said, finding his voice. There are legal procedures, mediation, negotiations. All handled, I said calmly. My attorney has been in touch with the court. The petition was filed this morning, financial disclosures are complete, and temporary orders are already in place. The locks at the house will be changed by 9 o'clock tonight. Wyatt's face went ashen. The house? You can't kick me out of my own house? Actually, I can. Turns out when you systematically hide assets and engage in financial abuse, courts are very sympathetic to the victim's need for security and stability. I smiled at him with genuine warmth. Don't worry, though. I'm sure Abigail has a lovely place where you can stay. How do you know about Abigail? Spencer whispered, though his question was clearly directed at Wyatt. Everyone knows about Abigail, I said matter-of-factly. The partners at your firm, the staff at your favorite hotels, probably half the people in this restaurant by now. The only person who didn't know was me, and that was by design. Wyatt needed me ignorant and compliant for his plan to work. I opened my purse one more time and withdrew a single sheet of paper, placing it on the table with ceremonial precision. What's that? Wyatt asked, though he seemed afraid to touch it. A list of all the assets you tried to hide. Bank accounts in the Cayman Islands, investments transferred to shell companies, the vacation property in Aspen you bought under your mother's name. My forensic accountant was very thorough. Spencer let out a low whistle. Jesus, Wyatt, how much money are we talking about? Enough to constitute felony fraud, I said helpfully. The district attorney's office has been very interested in the documentation we've provided. Something about wealthy professionals who think they're above financial disclosure laws. Wyatt's hands were shaking now, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. You're bluffing. You don't have the resources to investigate? I had 5 years to prepare, I interrupted. 5 years of watching you underestimate me, dismiss me, treat me like an inconvenient accessory to your brilliant life. Did you really think I'd just accept whatever crumbs you decided to throw me? The waiter approached our table tentatively, clearly uncomfortable with the scene unfolding in his section. Is everything all right here? Can I bring you anything else? Actually, I said, turning to him with a bright smile, could you bring Mr. Hugh the check? I believe his evening is about to become much more expensive than he anticipated. Brianna, please, Wyatt said. We can work this out. We don't have to involve lawyers and courts. We can handle this privately, amicably.
The way you handled your affair? Privately and amicably? I shook my head. I don't think so. You made your choices, Wyatt. You planned this entire scenario, bet money on my emotional breakdown, systematically hid assets to ensure I'd be left with nothing. The only thing you didn't plan for was me fighting back. I pulled out my phone and showed them one final photo, a screenshot of their text conversation from 3 days ago, where Spencer had written, "She'll be crying into her wine by dessert." Easy money. Easy money, I repeated, looking directly at Spencer. That's what you called my pain. That's how much my 5-year marriage was worth to you, entertainment and a friendly wager. Spencer couldn't meet my eyes. Brianna, that was just we didn't mean. You meant exactly what you said. And now you get to live with the consequences of underestimating the woman you thought was too weak, too stupid, and too dependent to see what was happening right in front of her. I slung my purse over my shoulder and looked down at both men, one slumped in defeat, the other pale with shock. The papers will be served at your office tomorrow morning, I told Wyatt, along with copies of all the evidence we've compiled. Your partners might find the financial irregularities particularly interesting, given the firm's reputation. My job, he whispered. You're trying to destroy my career. I'm not trying to destroy anything, I said simply. I'm just refusing to participate in my own destruction anymore. There's a difference. As I walked toward the restaurant's exit, I could feel every eye in the room following me. But instead of the shame I'd carried for 5 years, I felt something I'd almost forgotten existed: pride. The valet brought my car around, and as I slipped behind the wheel, I caught a glimpse of myself in the rearview mirror. The woman looking back wasn't the diminished, apologetic wife who'd walked into that restaurant. She was someone who'd remembered her own worth and decided to fight for it. My phone buzzed with a text from Diane. How did it go? I smiled as I typed back, better than expected. Much better. The drive home felt like traveling through a different city entirely. The same streets I'd navigated for 5 years looked unfamiliar, as if I were seeing them for the first time. Or perhaps I was seeing them as myself for the first time in years, not filtered through Wyatt's preferences and judgments. My phone rang as I pulled into our driveway. Elaine's name flashed on the screen. How did he take it? She asked, without preamble. About as well as you'd expect from someone who just realized his victim has been 3 steps ahead of him for months. I sat in the car for a moment, looking at the house that would soon be mine alone. He tried to regain control, of course. Suggested we handle things privately and amicably. Elaine's laugh was sharp. They always do. Men like your husband can't accept that they've been outmaneuvered, especially by someone they've spent years diminishing. How are you feeling? It was a good question. I expected to feel triumphant, vindicated, maybe even a little guilty about the public humiliation I just orchestrated. Instead, I felt something simpler and more profound: relief. Free, I said. And the word carried more weight than I'd expected. Good. That's exactly how you should feel. Now, about tomorrow, the papers will be served at his office first thing in the morning. I've also arranged for copies to be delivered to the managing partners. Given what we've uncovered about his financial irregularities, they'll need to conduct their own investigation. Inside the house, I found evidence of Wyatt's hasty preparation for our evening. His cologne lingered in the air, his good cufflinks were missing from the dresser, and there was a jewelry box on the nightstand, opened and empty. Whatever he'd bought for Abigail, he'd been carrying it with him tonight, probably planning to present it after I'd been properly devastated. I wondered if he'd given it to her yet, or if it was still sitting in his jacket pocket while he tried to process what had just happened. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. This is Abigail Sanders. Can we talk? I stared at the message for a long moment, the other woman, reaching out in the aftermath of my husband's public humiliation. Part of me was curious about what she had to say, but a larger part recognized this for what it was: an attempt to insert herself into a situation that no longer concerned her. I deleted the message without responding. At exactly 9 o'clock, the locksmith arrived, a different man than before, but with the same understanding discretion. He worked efficiently, replacing every lock on the house, while I packed Wyatt's belongings into suitcases I set on the front porch. "Clean break?" he asked, as he finished the last door. "The cleanest," I replied.
By 10:30, I was alone in my house. Truly my house now, for the first time in 5 years. The silence felt different than it had that morning. Not empty, but full of possibility. I made tea, lit the sandalwood candles Wyatt had always claimed gave him headaches, and sat in my living room thinking about the woman I'd been when I walked down the aisle 7 years ago. Young, hopeful, convinced that love meant merging your life completely with someone else's until you couldn't tell where you ended and they began. I knew better now. Love wasn't supposed to diminish you. It was supposed to make you more yourself, not less. My phone rang again. This time it was Diane. "I've been dying to call," she said. "How did it go? Are you okay? Do you need me to come over?" "I'm perfect," I said, and meant it completely. I'm absolutely perfect. The next morning brought a series of phone calls that felt like watching dominoes fall in slow motion. The first came at 7:30 from Elaine. "The papers were served at his office an hour ago," she said, her voice carrying barely contained satisfaction. "According to my contact there, he went straight into the managing partner's office and hasn't come out yet." "What about the financial irregularities?" "Already under investigation. The firm's compliance officer is reviewing all his cases from the past 2 years. If they find what we think they'll find, his legal career is effectively over." I sat at my kitchen counter, drinking coffee from my grandmother's china, the set Wyatt had always deemed too old-fashioned for company, and processed this information with surprising detachment. A year ago, the thought of Wyatt losing his career would have devastated me. Now it felt like natural consequences finally catching up with calculated cruelty. The second call came from my sister at 8:15. "Have you seen the news?" "What news?" Channel 7 ran a story about prominent lawyer facing domestic abuse allegations. They didn't name names, but the details are pretty specific. Something about financial fraud and systematic psychological manipulation. I turned on the television and watched a reporter standing outside Wyatt's office building discussing a case that involved a respected attorney accused of hiding marital assets while conducting an extramarital affair. The story was careful to avoid naming him directly, but anyone who knew us would recognize the details. "How do you feel about it being public?" Diane asked. "Honest, I feel like other women need to know that this kind of behavior has consequences, that you don't have to accept being diminished just because someone does it gradually enough that you don't notice." The third call came from an unexpected source, Selma at the Women's Center. "I saw the news," she said, without preamble. "Are you all right?" "I'm better than all right. I'm free." "I'm proud of you, Brianna. What you did takes incredible courage. Most women in your situation never find the strength to fight back so strategically." "I learned from the best teachers," I said. "The women in those support groups, they showed me what survival looks like, what recovery looks like." Speaking of which, we've had several new intake calls this morning. Women who saw the story and want to know if they might be experiencing similar situations. Would you be interested in helping with those assessments? Your personal experience combined with your psychology background. "Yes," I said without hesitation. "Absolutely yes." The fourth call, at noon, was the most satisfying. Spencer's number flashed on my screen, and curiosity got the better of me. "Brianna?" His voice was strained, uncertain. "I wanted to apologize. About last night, about the things I said, about the bet." "Save it, Spencer. You're not sorry about what you did. You're sorry about the consequences." "That's not true. I never meant." "You meant exactly what you said. You thought my pain was entertainment. You thought I was so pathetic that my emotional breakdown would be worth betting money on." I paused, letting that sink in. Silence. "The bet was for $500, he said finally, his voice barely audible. $500. That's what you thought my 5 years of marriage were worth. My emotional devastation was worth a dinner at a nice restaurant to you." "Brianna, please." I hope it was worth it, Spencer, because now everyone you know, everyone you work with, everyone in your social circle knows exactly what kind of person you are, the kind who bets on a friend's wife having a nervous breakdown. I hung up before he could respond. That afternoon, I drove to the Women's Center and sat in on a support group. The women there had followed the news story, and several approached me afterward. "You're her, aren't you?" asked a woman named Sarah. "The one from the story?" I nodded.
Thank you, she said simply, for showing us that we can fight back, that we don't have to just accept it when someone tries to destroy us. Driving home that evening, I realized something profound had shifted. For 5 years, I'd moved through the world as half a person, always conscious of how my choices reflected on Wyatt, always editing myself to fit his vision of who I should be. Now, I was driving my own car to my own house, making my own decisions about how to spend my evening. I was whole again, complete in myself, rather than just an extension of someone else's life. It was the most beautiful feeling I'd ever experienced. 3 weeks after Valentine's Day, the full scope of Wyatt's downfall became clear. Elaine called me with updates that felt like reading the final chapters of a book I'd been writing for months. "The State Bar Association has opened a formal investigation," she reported. "The financial irregularities go deeper than we initially thought. He's been using client trust funds to cover his personal expenses, including his affair with Abigail." Client funds? I set down my coffee cup, genuinely shocked. That's not just unethical, that's criminal. Exactly. The district attorney's office is considering charges of embezzlement and fraud, and the firm has terminated his partnership effective immediately. They're trying to distance themselves from the scandal as quickly as possible. I thought about Wyatt's pride in that partnership, how he'd worn it like armor against any criticism. His professional identity had been everything to him, more important than our marriage, more important than basic honesty or human decency. What about Abigail? Interesting development there. She's cooperating fully with the investigation and has provided testimony about his attempts to involve her in the asset hiding scheme. Apparently, when she realized the legal implications, she decided her career was more important than their relationship. I found myself almost feeling sorry for Wyatt. Almost. He'd lost his wife, his career, his reputation, and now his mistress in the span of 3 weeks. But then I remembered the calculated cruelty of his plan, the bet with Spencer, the years of systematic diminishment, and my sympathy evaporated. "There's more," Elaine continued. "The forensic accountant found additional hidden assets, a yacht registered in Delaware, cryptocurrency accounts, even a wine collection stored under a false name. The total value of what he tried to hide is close to $2 million. $2 million. Money that should have been marital property, assets I should have known about, financial security he'd denied me while claiming I was too irresponsible to handle our family finances. Can we recover it? All of it, plus penalties and legal fees. The court doesn't look kindly on spouses who engage in fraudulent concealment, especially when it's combined with other forms of abuse. The social consequences were almost as devastating as the legal ones. Wyatt's professional network, the same colleagues who'd once laughed at his jokes about training wives, now crossed the street to avoid him. The country club revoked his membership. Even his tennis partners found excuses not to return his calls. Spencer fared little better. Word had spread about his role in the Valentine's Day debacle, about the bet he'd made on my emotional breakdown. His own wife filed for separation after learning about his gambling habit and his casual cruelty toward other women. "Karma," Diane said when she told me about Spencer's wife leaving. Beautiful, poetic karma. The media attention continued for several weeks, but it took an unexpected turn. Instead of focusing on the salacious details of a wealthy lawyer's affair, reporters began examining the broader issue of financial abuse in marriages. I gave several interviews about the warning signs, the way sophisticated abusers use their education and professional status as tools of control. "The most dangerous abusers are often the most charming," I told one reporter. "They're the ones who seem perfect to outsiders, who have everyone convinced they're wonderful husbands and fathers.
That's exactly what makes their behavior so insidious. My work at the Women's Center expanded. The publicity had brought in donations and volunteers, but more importantly, it encouraged other women to recognize their own situations. I started facilitating weekly support groups, using my psychology training and personal experience to help others navigate similar circumstances. "You saved my life," one woman told me after a particularly intense session. Not dramatically, not all at once, but by showing me that what I was experiencing had a name, that it wasn't my fault, that I deserved better. Those moments made everything worth it. The public scrutiny, the painful legal proceedings, even the years of suffering that had led to this point. My pain had become purpose. My survival had become a roadmap for others. But perhaps the most satisfying victory was the simplest one. 6 months after Valentine's Day, I was grocery shopping when I ran into a former neighbor, someone from Wyatt's social circle who had always treated me with polite condescension. "Brianna," she said, her voice careful and uncertain, "how are you doing? I heard about everything that happened." "I'm wonderful," I said, and meant it completely. "Better than I've been in years." She looked at me with something approaching awe. "You seem different, stronger." "I'm the same person I always was," I replied. "I just remember who that person is now." A year after Valentine's Day, I moved out of the house that had been my prison disguised as a palace. Not because I had to, the court settlement had awarded it to me along with most of our other assets, but because I wanted to. Every room held memories of the woman I'd been when I was slowly disappearing, and I was ready to create new memories as the woman I'd become. The new place was smaller but entirely mine. I chose every piece of furniture, every paint color, every detail without consulting anyone else's preferences. The walls were sage green instead of Wyatt's preferred beige. The bookshelves were filled with psychology texts and novels he would have called frivolous. I hung artwork that made me happy rather than impressed guests I didn't want to entertain. My work at the Women's Center had evolved into something I'd never imagined possible. The media attention had led to speaking engagements, consulting opportunities, even a book deal to write about financial abuse in marriages. I was building a career around helping others recognize and escape the same patterns that had nearly destroyed me. "You've become quite the advocate," Selma said during one of our regular coffee meetings. "The women you work with look up to you in ways you probably don't realize." She was right. I received emails weekly from women across the country who'd read my interviews or attended my talks. They shared stories that mirrored my own. Brilliant, successful men who used their intelligence as weapons, who isolated their partners so gradually that the women didn't notice until they were completely dependent. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in my relationship with myself. I'd started dating again, carefully and selectively. Not because I needed someone to complete me, but because I'd remembered what it felt like to be seen and valued by someone who didn't want to change me. His name was Dr. Asher Weaver, a trauma therapist I'd met through my work at the center. He was kind without being patronizing, supportive without being controlling, interested in my thoughts without trying to reshape them. Most importantly, he made me laugh in ways I'd forgotten were possible. "You know what I love about you?" he said one evening as we walked through the park near my new house. "What?" I asked, genuinely curious. "You take up space. You have opinions. You argue with me when you disagree. You're fully yourself, not some edited version designed to please me." It was such a simple observation, but it made me realize how far I'd come. The woman who'd spent 5 years making herself smaller was now someone who filled rooms with her presence rather than fading into the background. On the second anniversary of that Valentine's Day, Diane threw me a party she called Independence Day. Friends from the Women's Center, colleagues from my speaking circuit, even some of my old college friends who'd found me again after years of lost contact. "To Brianna," Diane toasted, raising her glass of champagne, "who reminded us all that the most courageous thing you can do is refuse to disappear." As I looked around the room at faces filled with genuine affection and respect, I thought about the woman who'd stood in that restaurant 2 years ago, signing divorce papers with steady hands while her husband's world collapsed around him. She'd been brave, but she'd also been angry, focused on justice and consequences. This woman, the one surrounded by people who valued her for exactly who she wasn't angry anymore. She was grateful. Grateful for the hard-won wisdom, for the strength that had emerged from surviving, for the opportunity to help others find their own paths to freedom. The woman Wyatt had tried to break had become someone he never could have imagined, powerful not in spite of her pain, but because of what she'd learned from surviving it. 3 years later, I received an unexpected letter. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting immediately. Wyatt's careful script, the same penmanship that had once signed birthday cards and anniversary notes back when I believed those gestures meant something. I almost threw it away unopened. Then curiosity won. "Brianna," it began, "I know I have no right to contact you, and I don't expect you to respond. But I needed you to know that I understand now what I did to you, what I took from you, what I tried to make you believe about yourself." He was writing from a minimum security facility in upstate New York, serving 18 months for embezzlement and fraud. His law license had been permanently revoked. Abigail had testified against him in exchange for immunity, then moved across the country to start over somewhere his reputation couldn't follow her. "I told myself I was protecting you from difficult decisions, that I knew what was best for both of us. I convinced myself that love meant guidance, that caring meant control. I was wrong about everything." I read the letter twice, then set it aside. 3 years ago, those words might have meant something to me. An apology from the man who'd systematically dismantled my sense of self might have felt like closure, like validation. Now they felt irrelevant. Not because I was still angry, anger had long since transformed into something more useful, but because his understanding of his actions didn't change anything about who I'd become. I'd built my recovery on my own strength, not on waiting for him to acknowledge his cruelty. That evening, Asher found me in my study, grading papers from the graduate psychology course I now taught twice a week. He'd moved in 6 months earlier. Not because I needed him there, but because I wanted him there. The difference mattered more than I could have imagined. "You seem thoughtful tonight," he observed, settling into the chair across from my desk. Wyatt wrote to me, from prison, full of apologies and self-awareness. Asher waited, knowing I'd continue when I was ready. It was one of the things I loved about him. He didn't rush my thoughts or try to shape my responses. "I realized something reading it," I said finally. "I don't need his apology anymore. I don't need him to understand what he did or admit he was wrong. His opinion of me, good or bad, doesn't define my worth." "That's growth," Asher said simply. The next morning, I spoke to a group of law students about recognizing signs of domestic abuse in their future clients. As I looked out at their young, earnest faces, I thought about the woman I'd been at their age, so certain that intelligence was protection enough, that education would shield me from the kinds of manipulation I now spent my life helping others escape. "The most dangerous abusers are often the most charming," I told them, echoing words I'd spoken hundreds of times now. "They're the ones who seem perfect to outsiders, who use their intelligence and status as weapons. Your job isn't just to know the law, it's to recognize when someone is using legal structures to harm another person." During the question session afterward, a young woman raised her hand. "How do you help someone who doesn't realize they're being abused? Someone who thinks their partner is just trying to help them?" I smiled, remembering asking similar questions before I understood that I was describing my own situation. "You plant seeds," I said. "You provide information without judgment. You let them know that support exists when they're ready for it. And you remember that recognizing abuse is often a process, not a moment. It took me 5 years to understand what was happening to me, and I had a psychology degree." After the presentation, I drove home through streets that no longer felt like someone else's neighborhood. I owned my space in the world now, literally and figuratively. The house Wyatt had chosen, the life he'd designed, the small, grateful woman he'd tried to create, all of that was gone, replaced by something authentic and strong and entirely mine. That evening, I finally responded to Wyatt's letter, not with forgiveness or anger, but with something simpler. "I hope you find peace. I already have." I didn't sign it with love or even my name, just sealed the envelope and sent it on its way, closing a chapter that had been over for years but somehow needed that final punctuation mark. The woman who'd signed divorce papers on Valentine's Day without shedding a tear had been brave. But this woman, the one who could receive an apology from her abuser and feel nothing but mild interest, she was free. And freedom, I'd learned, was worth everything I'd fought to achieve it.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.